the human body begins to shut down at an internal temperature of 85 degrees. First comes the violent shivering, then the confusion, and finally a terrifying lethargic warmth that tricks your brain into thinking you're safe just before your heart stops. In the Bitterroot Valley of Montana, they thought they knew the cold. They mocked Alexander Pendleton when he spent his life savings burying a reinforced concrete fortress beneath his modest log cabin. They called him paranoid. They called him a lunatic. But when the historic deep freeze of the century shattered the power grid and turned million-dollar mansions into glass-paneled tombs, the laughter died. And then the desperate banging on Alexander's steel blast door began. Alexander Pendleton was not a man given to flights of fancy. A retired structural engineer from Seattle who had spent 35 years designing reinforced foundations for commercial skyscrapers, he dealt strictly in load-bearing calculations, sheer stress, and worst-case scenarios. When his wife Sarah passed away from an aggressive illness, the city lost its color. Seeking the silence only deep isolation could provide, Alexander purchased 40 acres of untamed, densely forested land just outside Darby, Montana. To the locals, Alexander was just another retiree from the coast driving up property taxes. But Alexander was different from the wealthy transplants building sprawling cinematic mansions. While his neighbors erected massive 6,000-square-foot monuments to their own egos, Alexander built a modest 1,200-square-foot log cabin. It was what he built underneath the cabin that caught everyone's attention. In early May, a convoy of heavy machinery rumbled up the dirt switchbacks of Pine Ridge Road. Tom Sully Sullivan, a local excavation contractor who had lived in the valley his whole life, pulled his F-350 onto Alexander's lot, staring in disbelief at the blueprints spread across the hood of Alexander's truck. "Alexander, buddy, you sure about this?" Sully asked, pushing back his sweat-stained Stetson. "You're asking me to dig a hole 30 feet deep and 40 feet wide into solid granite and compressed shale. I'm going to need a rock breaker attachment for the Cat 3 too. Oh, and it's going to cost you a small fortune. Are you building a cabin or a missile silo?" "Just follow the plans. Sully." Alexander replied, his voice calm, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I want it deep enough to maintain a constant geothermal temperature of 55 degrees, regardless of what the surface is doing." For 6 weeks, the valley echoed with the grinding metallic screech of heavy machinery breaking earth and stone. Word spread quickly. In a small town like Darby, a 30-foot crater is community property as far as gossip goes. That was when Alexander met Greg Higgins. Greg had recently sold a tech startup in California and purchased the 60-acre plot directly adjacent to Alexander's. Greg was a man who lived loudly. He drove a pristine electric Rivian truck that had never seen mud, wore designer flannel, and was currently building a massive glass-fronted A-frame chalet equipped with smart home technology, heated driveways, and imported Italian marble floors. One Tuesday afternoon, Greg wandered over to Alexander's property, a condescending smirk plastered across his perfectly tanned face. He peered over the edge of the massive excavation pit, watching the crew pour heavily reinforced high PSI concrete into thick steel forms. "Hey there, neighbor," Greg shouted over the roar of the cement mixers. "Building a swimming pool seems a little deep for laps." Alexander wiped the dust from his safety glasses. "It's a sub-level storage and utility space." Greg laughed, a booming theatrical sound meant for an audience. "Sub-level utility, right. Look, man, if you're waiting for the apocalypse, I hate to break it to you, but the world's not ending anytime soon. You prepper types crack me up. You're burying $500,000 in the dirt while the rest of us are enjoying the view." Alexander didn't argue. He just watched the concrete flow. He watched as the contractors installed R-60 aerospace-grade insulation panels, dual air filtration systems equipped with MERV-13 and carbon scrubbers, and a completely independent closed-loop geothermal heating system. He supervised the burial of a 10,000-gallon fiberglass cistern tapping directly into an underground aquifer, and the installation of a massive bank of lithium iron phosphate batteries connected to a concealed, low-profile solar array on the cabin's roof. Finally capping it all off was a custom-fabricated 6-inch thick steel vault door disguised seamlessly as the floorboards of his pantry. By the time the snow first dusted the peaks of the Bitterroot Range in October, Alexander's cabin looked like any other rustic home. But beneath it lay an impregnable, self-sustaining fortress. He stocked it with enough freeze-dried provisions, heirloom seeds, hydroponic lighting, and medical supplies to last 5 years. At the local diner, Alexander became the punchline to a long-running joke. "Hey, Artie," the waitress would say, pouring his morning black coffee. "Gonna be raining this weekend. Better lock yourself in the bunker before the sky falls." Alexander would simply leave a generous tip, offer a polite smile, and drive home. He didn't build the bunker out of fear. He built it out of mathematics. He understood systems. He understood the fragile, interconnected nature of the modern power grid. He knew that society's illusion of safety was suspended by thin copper wires spanning thousands of miles of wilderness. And as he looked at the erratic, anomalous atmospheric pressure readings on his ham radio station that November, Alexander knew the math was about to catch up with them. November in Montana is usually a brutal, unforgiving instructor teaching newcomers exactly what survival entails. But this year was bizarrely different. It was unseasonably warm. Temperatures hovered in the high 50s. The snowmelt turned the mountain roads into muddy creeks, and the locals walked around in light jackets, bewildered by the balmy autumn. For Greg Higgins and his wife Brenda, the mild weather was a vindication of their superiority. They hosted lavish weekend parties at their new compound, which they unironically named The Summit. The house was an architectural marvel and an engineering nightmare. The entire southern-facing wall was comprised of floor-to-ceiling triple-paned glass, offering a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the valley. It relied entirely on a complex, digitally controlled HVAC system powered by the local grid with a massive state-of-the-art diesel generator as backup. 2 days before Thanksgiving, Greg decided to host a massive neighborhood open house. He invited everyone on Pine Ridge Road, including Alexander. Surprisingly, Alexander accepted. The interior of the Higgins mansion was stiflingly hot, the thermostat pushed to a balmy 74 degrees despite the crisp evening air outside. Guests mingled with crystal wine glasses, marveling at the vaulted ceilings and the smart home panels that controlled everything from the window blinds to the shower temperature. Alexander stood quietly in the corner, nursing a glass of sparkling water, observing. He noticed the massive open-concept floor plan. He noticed the lack of a traditional wood-burning hearth. Greg had opted for a sleek gas-powered ribbon fireplace that provided aesthetics but negligible radiant heat. "Glad you could crawl out of your hole to join us, Alexander," Greg announced loudly, clapping a heavy hand on Alexander's shoulder. A few of the nearby guests, wealthy investors from Seattle and Denver, chuckled. "Beautiful home, Greg," Alexander said evenly. "The glass is stunning. How's the R value on those panes?" Greg waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, who cares? The house is smart, Artie. It constantly adjusts to ambient temperatures. If it gets cold, the radiant flooring kicks into overdrive. Plus, we're entirely backed up. If the grid blips, my Generac kicks in before the lights even flicker. You should have spent your money on tech, not concrete." Alexander looked out the massive glass wall at the darkening sky. The clouds were gathering not in the usual fluffy banks, but in dense, bruised-looking sheets. For the past 48 hours, Alexander had been tracking a deeply concerning meteorological phenomenon on the shortwave radio. A massive split in the polar vortex was occurring over the Arctic. A high-pressure ridge was locking it in place, preparing to funnel an unprecedented, dense mass of Arctic air directly down the spine of the Rocky Mountains. The National Weather Service was issuing standard winter storm warnings, but the fringe meteorological models, the raw data Alexander trusted, were predicting something catastrophic. A flash freeze event of historic proportions. Greg Alexander said, his voice dropping in volume, turning serious. The barometric pressure is dropping faster than I've ever seen. I know you have the generator, but do you have a secondary heat source, a wood stove? Do you have winterized diesel for the generator? Greg stared at him, the smile hardening into a sneer of genuine annoyance. Winterized diesel? Artie, I pay a property management company $3,000 a month to handle the utilities. It's 2026. We don't need to chop wood like pioneers anymore. Relax, have a canapé. Stop being so intensely grim all the time. Brenda Higgins, holding a Pomeranian, wearing a tiny cashmere sweater, drifted over. Is Alexander telling ghost stories about the weather again? She laughed. Our son Leo is coming up from Bozeman tomorrow in his new sports car. The roads are perfectly clear. Alexander nodded slowly, realizing the futility of his efforts. Drive safe, Leo, he muttered, setting his glass down. Thank you for the hospitality, Greg. Have a good evening. As Alexander walked back down the dirt road to his property, the wind began to shift. The warm, pine-scented breeze abruptly died, replaced by a strange, dead calm. The air tasted metallic. When he reached his cabin, Alexander didn't go to bed. He went to his pantry. He pulled the heavy lever, disengaging the hydraulic locks, and the floorboards hissed upward, revealing the concrete stairs descending into the earth. Down in the bunker, the air was perfectly still and 55 degrees. He walked to the main power terminal, switched the solar intake from the cabin grid to the deep cycle batteries, and ran a diagnostic on the geothermal pumps. Everything was green. Everything was ready. Upstairs, Alexander spent the next 3 hours gathering the last of his surface supplies, books, a few comfortable blankets, and his wife's photo albums, and carried them down into the vault. When he finally looked out the cabin window at 2 a.m., the first flakes had begun to fall. They weren't soft, picturesque snowflakes. They were tiny, hard pellets of ice, driving sideways in a wind that sounded like a low, hungry growl. The trap was setting, and the valley was completely unprepared. It started on the morning of December 4th. At 6 a.m., the temperature outside Alexander's cabin was a manageable 32 degrees Fahrenheit. By 8 a.m., it was 10 degrees. By 10 a.m., it had plummeted to -15. The mercury was falling so rapidly it defied meteorological history, dropping an astonishing 47 degrees in 4 hours. This was no ordinary winter storm. It was an atmospheric sledgehammer. The split polar vortex had collapsed directly over western Montana, bringing with it temperatures usually reserved for the stratosphere. And with the cold came the wind, violent sustained gusts of 70 miles per hour that turned the falling snow into a blinding, abrasive whiteout. Alexander watched the digital thermometer mounted on his cabin wall from the safety of his living room. The glass of his heavy-duty windows was groaning under the wind pressure, thick webs of frost crawling rapidly across the panes like living vines. Outside, the world had been erased in a swirl of violent gray and white. Then the physical destruction began. The extreme rapid drop in temperature caused the sap inside the towering ponderosa pines to freeze solid. Because water expands when it freezes, the pressure inside the tree trunks became explosive. Alexander flinched as a sound like a high-caliber rifle gunshot echoed over the roar of the wind. Crack. Then another. Crack. Giant trees, some hundreds of years old, were literally detonating in the forest, their trunks splitting open under the sheer force of the expanding ice. At 11:15 a.m., the power grid surrendered. It wasn't a localized outage. The extreme cold, combined with hurricane-force winds and the weight of flash-frozen ice on the lines, snapped major transmission towers spanning across the county line. The entire Bitterroot Valley from Missoula down to the Idaho border plunged into darkness. Alexander saw the lights flicker, surge brightly for a fraction of a second, and die. He didn't panic. He simply picked up his thermos of coffee, locked the heavy deadbolts on the cabin's reinforced front door, and walked to the pantry. He descended the stairs, pulled the heavy steel vault door shut above him, and spun the locking wheel. The heavy clunk of the steel bolt sliding into the concrete frame was the most comforting sound in the world. Down in the bunker, the automated systems instantly recognized the loss of surface power. The LED lighting flickered on, bathing the concrete walls in a warm, steady glow. The geothermal air exchange hummed to life. It was a perfectly regulated, quiet sanctuary. He was safe. Less than a mile away, the situation at the Higgins estate was rapidly descending into chaos. When the grid failed, Greg Higgins was sitting in his home office trading stocks on his triple-monitor setup. The screens went black. The ambient hum of the massive HVAC system died. "Damn it!" Greg shouted, tossing his pen onto the desk. He walked out to the landing overlooking the massive living room. Brenda was sitting on the Italian leather sofa, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. "Greg, the Wi-Fi is down," she complained, looking at her phone. "And the lights." "Relax," Greg said, checking his silver wristwatch. "The backup generator will kick on in 10 seconds. They waited in silence. 10 seconds passed. Then 30. Then a full minute. The only sound was the terrifying rhythmic booming of the wind slamming against the massive wall of southern-facing windows. The glass was visibly flexing inward. "Greg," Brenda's voice was tighter now. "Why isn't it turning on?" "I'll go check the panel," Greg muttered, pulling on a heavy designer parka over his cashmere sweater. He walked into the attached 4-car garage where the transfer switch and the massive industrial diesel generator were housed. It was freezing in the garage. Greg popped the access panel on the generator and hit the manual override switch. The starter motor whined, but the engine didn't catch. He tried again. Nothing. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced Greg's arrogance. He ran to the diesel storage tank and unscrewed the cap, shining his phone's flashlight inside. He didn't see liquid. He saw a thick, cloudy, gelatinous mass. Alexander's warning echoed in his mind like a ghost. "Do you have winterized diesel?" "Regular diesel fuel contains paraffin wax. At extreme low temperatures, this wax crystallizes, turning the liquid fuel into a thick, useless gel that clogs fuel lines and filters." The property management company, assuming the massive garage would remain climate-controlled by the house's grid power, hadn't bothered to add the expensive anti-gel winterizing agents to the 500-gallon tank. The generator was dead. The multi-million-dollar estate had zero power. Greg sprinted back into the house. The temperature inside was dropping at a terrifying rate. Without the radiant floor heating to combat the massive heat loss from the giant windows, the open concept mansion was transforming into an ice box. It was already down to 45 degrees inside. "It's dead," Greg said, his breath visible in the air of his own living room. "The fuel gelled. We have no power." Brenda stood up, clutching the dog. "What do you mean we have no power?" "Turn on the fireplace." "It's electronic ignition," Greg yelled, losing his temper. "The gas valve requires an electrical signal to open. It's a prop, Brenda." He pulled out his phone. No cell service. The nearest cell tower, located on a peak 3 miles away, had been ripped apart by the wind. Upstairs, 19-year-old Leo, who had barely made it up the mountain in his BMW before the snow started banking, came running down the stairs. "Dad, it's freezing up there. What's going on?" "Put your coats on," Greg ordered, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Put everything you have on. We need to leave. We need to get down the mountain to the hotel in town." They bundled up in ski gear and ran to the garage. Greg hit the button for the motorized garage doors. Nothing happened. They were grid-tied. Cursing, he climbed up a ladder to pull the manual release cord. He heaved with all his might, but the door wouldn't budge. The driving rain from the previous day had pooled at the base of the door, and the flash freeze had welded the rubber seal to the concrete driveway with a 2-inch thick block of solid ice. They were trapped inside the house. By 4 p.m., the interior temperature of the Higgins home hit 20 degrees. The water in the imported marble toilets began to freeze and crack the porcelain. The decorative indoor plants blackened and wilted. Greg, Brenda, and Leo huddled under a pile of down comforters in the center of the living room, their teeth chattering violently. "We can't stay here," Leo stammered, his lips turning a pale, dangerous shade of blue. "Dad will die in here tonight. It's supposed to hit -50. Greg looked out the window. The snow was drifting to 5 feet high against the glass. The road was gone. But through the swirling white chaos, he remembered the joke. He remembered the massive, ridiculous hole in the ground next door. He remembered the poured concrete, the deep earth geothermal lines, the smug look on Alexander Pendleton's face. Alexander. Greg whispered, his breath pluming in the freezing air. The crazy bastard's bunker. He looked at his wife and son. We have to walk to the neighbor's house. Alexander's? Brenda cried out, shivering. It's a quarter mile through the woods in this wind. We won't make it. If we stay here, we are dead by morning. Greg said, his voice finally stripped of all its usual bravado. Get your snowshoes. We have to go, now. The side door of the Higgins Estates mudroom opened inward, a minor architectural detail that likely saved their lives as the snowdrift against the exterior wall had already crested 5 feet. When Greg yanked the door open, the wind did not merely blow. It invaded. A horizontal torrent of blinding white ice crystals blasted into the house, instantly dropping the mudroom's temperature to sub-zero. Stay tethered! Greg screamed over the deafening roar of the gale. He had tied a length of heavy-duty climbing rope around his waist, looping it to Brenda and tying off the rear end to Leo. The Pomeranian was zipped securely inside Leo's heavy down parka, shivering violently against the boy's chest. They stepped out into the void, a quarter of a mile. On a clear summer day, it was a brisk 5-minute walk through a beautiful stand of old-growth ponderosa pines. Today, it was a lunar landscape of shifting, deadly white. The ambient temperature was now negative 32 degrees Fahrenheit, but the wind chill driven by sustained 60-mile-per-hour gusts plunged the effective temperature to a staggering negative 70. At negative 70 degrees, exposed human skin freezes solid in less than 3 minutes. The air is so devoid of moisture that every inhalation feels like swallowing ground glass. The moisture in their eyes began to freeze, forcing them to blink rapidly just to keep their eyelids from sealing shut. Greg took the lead, his high-end aluminum snowshoes biting into the powdery drift. He was a physically fit man, a marathon runner who prided himself on his stamina, but within 30 yards, his lungs were burning with a sharp, agonizing fire. The snow was not packing. It was a loose, dry powder that provided no base. With every step, even with the snowshoes, they sank to their knees, forcing them to high step through a resistant freezing quicksand. Keep moving! Greg roared, though the wind snatched the words from his mouth before they could reach Brenda, who was only 10 feet behind him. Brenda was struggling. Her designer ski wear, rated for a pleasant afternoon on the groomed slopes of Aspen, was completely inadequate for a historic atmospheric anomaly. The wind cut straight through the Gore-Tex shell, stripping the heat from her core. She stumbled, her snowshoe catching on a buried branch, and pitched forward into a drift. The rope yanked taut. Greg stopped and turned, shielding his face with his heavy mittens. He hauled on the rope, dragging his wife upright. Her face was hidden behind a ski mask and goggles, but he could see the sheer panic in her body language. Behind her, Leo was leaning forward against the wind, his arms wrapped tightly across his chest to protect the dog, his head down. "Dad, I can't feel my feet!" Leo's voice was a thin, reedy shriek barely audible over the storm. "Don't stop, walk!" Greg bellowed. The forest, usually a silent, stoic presence, was a war zone. The terrifying crack of freezing tree trunks detonating echoed like artillery fire. Entire limbs, heavy with frozen sap and ice, snapped off and crashed into the snow around them. They were navigating a minefield, blind and freezing. Time lost its meaning. It could have been 20 minutes or 2 hours. Greg's world shrank to the 3 feet of swirling snow in front of him. His hands and feet had long since gone numb, replaced by a dull, throbbing wooden sensation. His mind began to play tricks on him, a symptom of severe hypothermia setting in. A strange, lethargic warmth started to spread through his chest, the dangerous, deceptive flush of blood vessels dilating as the brain loses control of thermal regulation. He wanted to sit down, just for a minute. The snow looked incredibly soft. Then his snowshoe struck something hard. He looked up, wiping the rime ice from his goggles. Through the whiteout, a dark, rectangular shape materialized. It was the heavy timber of Alexander's front porch. They had made it to the cabin. A surge of desperate adrenaline flooded Greg's system. He turned and hauled on the rope, pulling Brenda and Leo up the slight incline toward the wooden structure. They collapsed onto the sheltered floorboards of the porch, shielded from the direct assault of the wind. Greg scrambled on his knees to the heavy solid oak front door. He pounded his heavily mittened fists against the wood. "Alexander, Alexander, open up!" He screamed, his voice cracking. Silence. He took off his mitten, exposing his bare, stark white knuckles to the freezing air, and banged harder, the skin immediately tearing and bleeding against the rough wood. "Alexander, we're dying out here, please." He scrambled to the window, cupping his hands against the heavy triple-paned glass. It was pitch black inside. No firelight, no LED lanterns, no movement. "He's not here!" Leo sobbed, collapsing against the wooden siding, his teeth clacking together in a violent rhythm. "Dad, the cabin is empty." Brenda lay on the porch, too weak to sit up, her breathing shallow and ragged. Greg leaned his head against the frozen door, tears welling in his eyes and instantly freezing to his cheeks. His arrogance, his money, his state-of-the-art house, none of it mattered. He had led his family out of a freezing house only to die on a neighbor's porch. He hammered his bleeding fist against the door, one last pathetic time, surrendering to the cold. 30 feet below the freezing porch, Alexander Pendleton was sitting in a comfortable leather recliner, sipping a mug of hot Earl Grey tea. The bunker was a steady, perfectly regulated 55 degrees. The heavy insulated walls blocked out the apocalyptic roar of the wind above, leaving only the quiet, rhythmic hum of the air filtration system and the soft ticking of a mechanical clock on his desk. Alexander was staring at a bank of 3 monitors mounted above his communication station. 2 of the screens were filled with cascading atmospheric data and radio frequencies, but the third was entirely black. It was the feed from the surface security cameras. The extreme cold had destroyed the motorized gimbals, and the lenses were thickly encased in ice. Visually, he was blind to the world above. However, Alexander was a man of redundancy. He didn't just rely on optical lenses. Buried within the heavy timber columns of the front porch were hardened solid-state piezoelectric vibration sensors originally intended to alert him to trespassing bears or elk. As he took a sip of his tea, a small amber light on the control console blinked. Tap, tap, tap. Alexander froze. He set the mug down, his eyes locked on the console. The amber light flashed again, more frantically this time. Then, a sustained rhythmic pulsing. Someone or something was desperately striking the front door. Alexander's mind raced through the permutations. It couldn't be an animal. The rhythm was erratic, but distinctly human. Desperate. He stood up, walking toward the heavy steel vault door that sealed him in. He placed his hand on the cold locking wheel. A fierce internal debate raged within him. This bunker was meticulously calculated for one human metabolism. The oxygen scrubbers, the caloric storage, the battery load, everything was balanced on a razor's edge of long-term sustainability for a single occupant. To open the door was to invite chaos into a closed system. Moreover, who was out there? The valley was vast. If it was a stranger, could they be trusted? The amber light on the console flashed rapidly, then stopped completely. A terrifying stillness settled over the indicator panel. Alexander looked at a framed photograph on his desk, Sarah smiling on a beach in Oregon. She had always chided him for his clinical approach to humanity. "You can engineer a building, Artie," she used to say, "but you can't engineer a soul. Sometimes you just have to open the door." "Damn it," Alexander whispered. He moved with practiced speed. He grabbed a heavy battery-powered heated jacket, pulled on a balaclava, and grabbed a heavy-duty pry bar and a medical jump kit. He spun the massive steel wheel of the vault door. The heavy locking bolts retracted with a solid mechanical clank. He pushed the heavy floor hatch open and ascended the concrete stairs into the pitch-black freezing cabin. The temperature inside the cabin was hovering around 10 degrees. He moved to the front door, disengaged the 3 heavy deadbolts, and braced himself. He pulled the door inward. The wind howled through the crack, throwing a spray of fine ice into his face. On the porch, partially buried under a fresh snowdrift, were three bodies huddled together in a chaotic tangle of climbing rope. "Hey!" Alexander shouted, his voice cutting through the wind. Greg Higgins lifted his head. His face was a horrifying mask of frost. His lips were blue. His eyelashes caked in heavy ice, and a patch of stark white frozen skin had formed on his left cheek. "Alexander," Greg rasped the sound barely escaping his throat. "Please." Alexander didn't waste time on pleasantries. He grabbed Greg by the collar of his parka and hauled him backward into the cabin. Greg was dead weight, his muscles unresponsive. Alexander dumped him on the floorboard and reached back out into the maelstrom, grabbing Brenda's coat. She was completely unresponsive. He dragged her inside, then grabbed Leo, pulling the boy and the bundled dog over the threshold. Alexander slammed the heavy oak door shut, throwing his weight against it to overcome the wind pressure, and drove the deadbolts home. The sudden cessation of the wind noise was deafening. "Get up," Alexander barked, clicking on a powerful LED tactical flashlight. "You cannot stay up here. You'll die in 20 minutes. On your feet, now." Greg tried to push himself up, but his hands slipped on the wooden floor. He looked at his fingers. They were white, rigid, and completely numb. I can't move." Alexander grabbed the climbing rope that still tethered them together and hauled Greg to his knees. "Crawl then, to the pantry. Move." Alexander grabbed Brenda by the shoulders and half-carried, half-dragged her across the room. Leo stumbled behind, clutching the jacket containing the dog. They reached the open floor hatch in the pantry. A warm yellow light spilled upward from the depths of the earth, carrying with it the faint miraculous smell of heated air. "Down the stairs," Alexander commanded. "Do not touch the metal railings with your bare skin. Go." Greg tumbled down the concrete steps, lacking the coordination to walk. Leo followed, sliding down on his rear. Alexander descended last, carrying Brenda in a fireman's carry. Once they were all at the bottom, Alexander reached up, grabbed the heavy hydraulic handle, and pulled. The massive steel floorboards hissed downward, sealing flush with the concrete frame. Alexander spun the locking wheel, the heavy steel bolts driving into the reinforced granite walls. The storm above ceased to exist. They were entombed, and they were safe. The Higgins family lay scattered on the concrete floor of the bunker's main staging area, like casualties of a silent war. The ambient temperature of 55 degrees, which had felt cool to Alexander an hour ago, felt like a blast furnace to bodies hovering on the brink of severe hypothermia. Alexander moved with the clinical precision of a trauma nurse. "Do not rub your hands or feet," he ordered sharply, grabbing a pair of heavy trauma shears from his medical kit. "You have frostnip, possibly first-degree frostbite. Rubbing the tissue will cause the ice crystals in your cells to shred the skin. Lie still." He knelt beside Brenda, who was shivering so violently her teeth were visibly chipping. Alexander used the shears to cut away her frozen outer shell and the soaking wet layers beneath. When bringing a victim back from severe hypothermia, external heat must be applied gradually to the core, not the extremities, to prevent cold blood from rushing to the heart and causing cardiac arrest. Alexander pulled a heavy mylar thermal blanket from a shelf and wrapped it tightly around her torso, slipping a chemical heat pack wrapped in a towel under her armpits and against her groin. "Drink," Alexander said, pressing a lukewarm cup of water with dissolved electrolyte powder to Greg's lips. Greg's hands shook uncontrollably as he tried to grasp the cup. He looked around the brightly lit, immaculately organized bunker. Banks of deep cycle batteries hummed quietly against the far wall. Floor-to-ceiling metal shelving held neatly labeled color-coded bins of dehydrated food medical supplies and mechanical tools. A small hydroponic bay glowed with purple LED grow lights in the corner. It was a masterpiece of survival engineering, and Greg realized with a crushing wave of humility that he had mocked the very man who was now holding the water to his lips. "Alexander, Greg stammered, tears mixing with the melting ice on his face. "My house, it failed. The generator, the fuel, it all froze. The paraffin wax and standard diesel gels at 15 degrees. Alexander replied, his voice neutral, devoid of the "I told you so" Greg was expecting. "Without anti-gel additives, your backup system was useless. How long was the power out before you left?" "Yeah, 5 hours." Leo chimed in from the floor, unzipping his jacket. The Pomeranian poked its head out, whining softly. It was -10 inside the living room. Dad couldn't get the garage doors open to get the cars out. Alexander nodded, absorbing the data. He moved to Leo, checking the boy's extremities. "You're young. Your circulation kept you warmer. You'll keep your fingers." He looked at the dog. "The dog stays off the beds. If it urinates on the floor, it goes into the waste composter. I don't have the chemicals to sanitize biological hazards outside the designated systems." Greg nodded rapidly. "Whatever you say, Alexander. Anything. Just thank you. We'd be dead." For the next 2 hours, the bunker was quiet, save for the hum of the air system and the ragged breathing of the survivors as their bodies slowly acclimated to the warmth. Alexander monitored their vitals, satisfied that while they would suffer severe tissue pain over the next few days, they would live. Once the immediate medical crisis had passed, Alexander walked to the center of the room and stood under the main light bank. He clasped his hands behind his back. "Ikiktarm." "Listen to me carefully," Alexander said, his voice echoing slightly off the concrete walls. The tone was not hostile, but it was absolutely uncompromising. "You are alive because I opened that door. But surviving the freeze was only the first variable in the equation. Now we have to survive the bunker." Greg, sitting up with a thermal blanket wrapped around his shoulders, looked confused. "What do you mean?" "You have food for years here. I've seen the trucks delivering it." "I have food for one person for 5 years," Alexander corrected him. "I have oxygen scrubbing capacity designed for one adult respiration rate. I have a water filtration and geothermal system balanced for one thermal output. You have just quadrupled the biological load on a closed ecosystem." Alexander walked over to a whiteboard mounted near his desk, picking up a dry erase marker. "This is not a vacation home, Greg. This is a submarine. Every breath you take, every calorie you burn, every flush of the chemical toilet affects the math." Alexander drew a rapid series of calculations on the board. "The carbon dioxide output of 4 humans and a dog will overwhelm my primary scrubber in 72 hours. I will have to manually bypass the secondary system, which drains the battery reserves faster." Brenda, finally sitting up, looked terrified. "How long do we have to stay down here? Can't we just call for help when the storm passes?" Alexander set the marker down. He walked over to his ham radio station and flipped a switch. He turned the dial through the emergency broadcast frequencies. Static. Pure, hissing static. "The atmospheric pressure anomaly isn't moving," Alexander explained grimly. "The ridge has locked the polar vortex in place. The surface temperature is projected to remain below -30 for at least 2 weeks. The power grid in the Bitterroot Valley is completely destroyed. The transmission towers have snapped under the ice load. The plows cannot move because their diesel has gelled just like yours." Alexander turned back to face them, his eyes hard and pragmatic. "There is no cavalry coming, Brenda. FEMA cannot fly helicopters in this wind. The National Guard cannot drive up the mountain. We are completely, unequivocally cut off from the rest of the world." Greg swallowed hard, the reality of their situation settling heavily on his chest. "So, what are the rules, Alexander Reader?" "Rule number 1, Alexander said, holding up a finger. "I am the captain of this vessel. My word is absolute. If I tell you to sleep, you sleep. If I tell you to ration water, you ration water. There is no democracy in a survival situation. Democracy gets people killed when resources are finite." He held up a second finger. "Rule number 2, caloric restriction begins immediately. We will consume exactly 1,200 calories a day. You will feel hungry. You will ignore it. Your bodies are not expending energy to stay warm anymore, so you do not need a standard intake." He pointed to a corner of the room where a stationary bicycle was hooked up to a heavy alternator. "Rule number 3, you will each pedal that generator for 1 hour every day. The solar panels on the roof are buried under 6 feet of snow. Our battery banks are finite. You will pay for your oxygen and your heat with your sweat." Leo looked at the bicycle, then at Alexander. "What if we don't?" Alexander didn't blink. "Then I open the steel door, and you can walk back to your glass house. The silence in the bunker was profound. The Higgins family, accustomed to wealth buffering them from every harsh reality of life, sat in stunned obedience. The money in Greg's bank accounts was useless. The digital smart home was a frozen tomb. The only currency that mattered now was Watt's calories and the uncompromising rules of Alexander Pendleton. "Understood," Greg whispered, his head bowed. "We'll do whatever you say, Alexander." "Good," Alexander said, turning back to his control panel to monitor the rising CO2 levels in the air. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start the math." Above them, buried under feet of relentless snow and howling wind, the Bitterroot Valley continued to freeze, trapping the living and burying the dead in a silent white apocalypse. But 30 feet below the earth, inside a fortress of concrete and steel, 4 humans and a dog prepared for a different kind of endurance. The immediate danger had passed, but as Alexander watched the battery gauge dip by a fraction of a percent, he knew the real test was only just beginning. Fear makes people compliant, but hunger and confinement, those variables were much harder to control. By day 8, the bunker had lost its initial aura of salvation. It had become a submarine, suspended not in water but in a frozen ocean of earth and granite. The psychological toll of sudden extreme confinement is a documented phenomenon. In aerospace and submarine studies, it is known as ICE, Isolated Confined Extreme Environments. Alexander had designed the bunker's lighting to mimic the natural circadian rhythm of the sun, shifting from cool blue-white in the morning to a warm amber in the evening. But the human brain cannot be easily tricked. For the Higgins family, the transition was brutal. The 1,200-calorie daily ration, consisting mostly of hydrated lentils, fortified rice, and freeze-dried chicken, left a constant gnawing ache in their stomachs. Their bodies, accustomed to rich diets and effortless comfort, were now cannibalizing their own fat reserves. The physical space, though meticulously organized, felt smaller every hour. The constant, inescapable hum of the geothermal air exchange system became a physical weight pressing against their eardrums. Brenda spent most of her time wrapped in a thermal blanket on a cot, staring blankly at the concrete ceiling, mourning the loss of a world she still couldn't fully comprehend was gone. The Pomeranian Barnaby was lethargic, sensing the ambient stress and the strict rationing of his own food. But the most pressing issue was not psychological. It was chemical. Alexander stood before the environmental control panel, a clipboard in his hand, his brow furrowed. The digital readout for atmospheric carbon dioxide levels was flashing a dull, persistent yellow. CO2 concentration 3,800 parts per million. Normal outdoor air holds about 400 parts per million of CO2. Anything above 1,000 parts per million causes drowsiness and poor concentration. At 5,000 parts per million, toxicity begins headaches, nausea, increased heart rate, and slight oxygen deprivation. Alexander had engineered his primary filtration unit, which utilized granular soda lime to chemically bind and remove carbon dioxide from the recirculated air to handle his own respiration. He had engaged the secondary system on day 2, but the granules were degrading far faster than his math had projected. The reason was sitting on the cot across the room. Panic. Greg, Brenda, and Leo were living in a state of sustained low-level physiological terror. Their elevated heart rates and rapid, shallow breathing were dumping massive amounts of CO2 into the closed loop. Add the dogs panting, and the chemical scrubbers were suffocating. "Alexander?" Greg asked, pausing his exhausting stint on the stationary bicycle. Sweat dripped from his nose onto the metal handlebars. "You've been staring at that screen for 10 minutes. What's wrong?" Alexander turned his face unreadable. "The soda lime filters are exhausting their binding capacity. Our CO2 is approaching 4,000 parts per million. Have you had a headache today, Greg?" Greg blinked, wiping his forehead. Yeah, a dull one behind my eyes. I thought it was caffeine withdrawal." "It's hypercapnia," Alexander stated flatly. "Mild carbon dioxide poisoning. The scrubber is failing. I need to swap in the reserve chemical cartridges, but I only have 2 left. At our current respiration rate, they will last exactly 6 days. Leo looked up from the floor where he had been mindlessly shuffling a deck of cards. And what happens in 6 days? In 6 days, Alexander said, walking over to the heavy steel storage lockers, the CO2 levels will cross 10,000 parts per million. We will go to sleep and we will not wake up. A suffocating silence fell over the room. The reality of their entombment crashed over them anew. It wasn't just the cold outside trying to kill them. It was their own breath inside. But Alexander wasn't finished. He unlocked the food storage locker to pull out the evening rations, and his hands froze. He stared at the meticulously stacked Mylar bags of freeze-dried beef stroganoff. His inventory management was obsessive. Every calorie was tracked on a ledger. 3 bags were missing. Alexander turned around slowly. His eyes locked onto the Higgins family. Who has been in the supply locker? Greg stopped pedaling completely. What are you talking about? You have the only key. The primary key, yes, but the emergency override code is written on the underside of the medical desk in case I'm incapacitated. Alexander said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously quiet. 3 800-calorie bags are missing. That is 2 days of life for one person. Brenda sat up, clutching her blanket. Alexander, we haven't touched your food. We wouldn't. Alexander's gaze shifted to Leo. The 19-year-old boy looked away, his jaw tightening. Leo, Greg said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and sudden realization. Leo, look at me. Leo kept his eyes glued to the concrete floor. I was starving, Dad, he whispered, his voice cracking. My stomach felt like it was digesting itself. I just took a few bags at night when he was asleep. I didn't think it would matter. Look at all the food he has. It matters because of the math, Alexander roared, the sudden explosion of anger making the entire family flinch. He crossed the room in 3 strides, towering over the boy. This isn't a grocery store. Those calories were calculated against our battery load and our chemical filtration. Every time your metabolism spikes from processing unallocated food, you exhale more carbon dioxide. You are literally breathing our time away. Greg stood up from the bike, stepping between Alexander and his son. Back off, Alexander. He's just a kid. He's starving. He is an adult, and he is jeopardizing the structural integrity of this survival system. Alexander shot back, pointing a rigid finger at Greg. I told you on day 1, my word is absolute. You brought the chaos of your surface lives down here, your arrogance, your lack of discipline. Greg's hands clenched into fists, the instinct to protect his son, warring with the undeniable truth of Alexander's words. He looked at the flashing yellow light on the environmental panel. He looked at Alexander, the retired engineer who had tried to warn him, the man who had dragged his family out of the snow. Slowly, Greg uncurled his fists. He turned to Leo. Where are the empty wrappers, Leo? Leo reached under his cot and pulled out 3 crumpled silver Mylar bags. Greg snatched them from his son's hand and handed them to Alexander. It won't happen again, Alexander. I swear to God. What do we do now? How do we fix the air? Alexander took the wrappers, his anger subsiding into cold calculation. He walked back to the panel. We have to change the equation. If we can't decrease our CO2 output, we have to increase the power to the secondary electrical scrubbers. But the batteries are currently at 31%. So we pedal faster, Greg said, gesturing to the bike. Human kinetic energy won't bridge the deficit, Alexander replied. He looked upward toward the ceiling, toward the massive steel vault door. The storm outside has dropped to 20 miles per hour. The ambient temperature is -18. The solar array on the cabin roof is buried under at least 6 feet of packed ice and snow. Alexander looked back at Greg, his eyes hard. Someone has to go up there and dig out the panels. If we get the array online, I can run the industrial scrubbers and vent the CO2 to the surface. If we don't, we suffocate by Tuesday. Alexander pulled a heavy canvas duffel bag from the mechanical closet and unzipped it. Inside was a specialized extreme cold weather suit, a one-piece battery-heated insulated coverall used by Arctic research teams. I bought this for emergency surface repairs. Alexander explained, checking the charge on the lithium battery packs wired into the suit's lining. "But I am 68 years old. My cardiovascular system cannot handle the exertion of shoveling heavy ice at -20 degrees. A heart attack on that roof is a death sentence." Greg didn't hesitate. He stripped off his sweater and stepped toward the suit. "I'll do it." Brenda let out a stifled sob. "Greg, no. You'll freeze." "I froze because I was an idiot who thought money bought immunity from nature," Greg said, pulling the heavy coveralls up over his shoulders. He looked at Alexander. "Show me how the suit works." For the next hour, Alexander briefed Greg on the mission parameters. The physics of the cabin above them were dire. Because the interior of the cabin had dropped well below freezing for over a week, the moisture in the air and the moisture introduced when Alexander briefly opened the door to save them had sublimated and frozen against every surface. The interior of the log cabin was now a literal ice cave. "The trap door will be heavy. The hydraulic lines might be sluggish," Alexander warned, handing Greg a heavy steel ice spud, a long, heavy bar with a chisel tip and an avalanche shovel. "Once you are in the cabin, do not take off your gloves. The doorknobs will instantly tear the skin from your flesh. You must climb out the front window. The porch door is completely blocked by a 10-foot drift." Alexander secured a heavy climbing harness around Greg's waist, clipping a thick carabiner to a spool of static climbing rope anchored to the bunker's central support column. "You have 1 hour of battery heat. If you stay up there longer, the suit loses its thermal integrity and your core temperature will crash. Clear the snow off the 4 main panels on the south pitch. Once the sun hits the photovoltaic cells, the smart inverter will automatically route the juice down to us." Greg zipped the heavy parka up to his chin and pulled down the polarized goggles. He looked like an astronaut preparing for an EVA on a hostile, dead planet. He looked at Brenda, placing a thickly gloved hand on her shoulder, then nodded to Alexander. "I'm ready." Alexander moved to the main control panel and disengaged the magnetic locks on the vault door. He grabbed the hydraulic lever and pulled. With a protesting metallic groan, the heavy steel floorboards above them pushed upward. A shower of fine crystalline frost cascaded down the concrete stairs. The air that poured into the bunker wasn't just cold. It possessed a physical density, a biting, vicious weight that instantly sucked the warmth from the room. Greg stepped onto the stairs, the ice spud in one hand, the shovel in the other. He climbed into the darkness of the cabin. Alexander immediately pulled the lever sealing the vault door shut again to preserve their heat. Greg was on his own. Up in the cabin, the silence was absolute. The roaring wind of the previous week had died down to a low, haunting whistle. Greg clicked on his headlamp. The beam cut through the freezing air, reflecting off thousands of tiny ice crystals clinging to Alexander's furniture, the walls, the ceiling. It was beautiful in a terrifying, deadly way. Greg moved to the front window. The glass was bowed inward under the immense pressure of the snow banked against it. He used the butt of the ice spud to shatter the glass, stepping back as the triple pane shattered inward. A wall of solid white snow filled the frame. Using the avalanche shovel, Greg began to dig. The work was brutal. The snow was heavily compacted, requiring him to chip and carve his way out rather than scoop. Within 10 minutes, he was sweating inside the suit, a dangerous development. If his sweat froze, the thermal suit would become a refrigerator. He broke through the crust. The gray filtered light of the Montana winter spilled into the cabin. Greg squeezed through the window frame and pulled himself out into the frozen wasteland. The valley was unrecognizable. The towering pines were stripped of their needles, many snapped in half like toothpicks. Greg's massive glass-fronted mansion in the distance looked like a shattered black tooth jutting from the snow. The massive glass wall had completely collapsed inward under the pressure of the storm, filling the multi-million-dollar home with 50 tons of snow. Greg forced his focus away from his ruined home and turned to Alexander's roof. The snow was piled 6 feet high. He climbed the drift and stepped onto the roof. The pitch was steep and the ice was treacherous. He began to shovel. 10 minutes, 20 minutes, his shoulders screamed in agony, the lactic acid building up from the intense physical exertion in the oxygen-thin, freezing air. He hit the smooth, dark glass of the first solar panel. He used a soft brush attached to the shovel handle to clear the remaining frost. 1 panel down, 3 to go. At the 45-minute mark, the battery indicator on Greg's heated suit began to flash yellow. The cold was overwhelming the heating coils. He could feel a creeping numbness in his toes and fingertips. The wind was picking up again, biting through the heavy canvas. He cleared the second panel, then the third. He was working on the final panel when disaster struck. The structural integrity of the roof compromised by the massive weight of the ice and the sudden shifting of the load as Greg shoveled gave way. With a deafening crack, the wooden trusses beneath him snapped. The roof pitched violently. Greg lost his footing. He slid down the steep incline of the roof, his heavy boots scrabbling frantically for purchase on the slick ice. He was heading straight for the edge, a 2-story drop onto solid ice blocks below. "No!" Greg screamed, dropping the shovel. He slid over the edge, plummeting into the void. But the drop only lasted 5 feet. A brutal, rib-cracking jolt snapped him to a halt. The static climbing rope anchored 30 feet below, and the bunker had caught him. He dangled in the freezing air against the side of the cabin, the harness digging agonizingly into his thighs. His headlamp beam illuminated the 4th solar panel above him, entirely clear of snow. He had done it. Greg grabbed the heavy rope with his freezing hands, placed his boots against the icy log siding, and slowly, painfully rappelled himself down to the snowdrift below the window. His arms felt like lead. The suit's battery died, plunging him into the raw, -20-degree air. He crawled back through the shattered window, dragging the rope behind him, and collapsed on the cabin floor directly above the vault door. He struck the floorboards with the heavy head of the ice spud. Bang, bang, bang. 10 seconds later, the floor hissed open. Warm, golden light spilled up from the earth. Alexander's hands reached up, grabbing Greg by the harness, and hauled the exhausted man down into the bunker. Greg collapsed onto the concrete, gasping for air, his face pale and drawn. Alexander didn't check on Greg immediately. He sprinted to the main power terminal. The digital display, which had been resting at a critical 22%, blinked. A small green sun icon illuminated on the screen. Solar input 4.2 kilowatts. The numbers began to climb. Alexander slammed his hand onto a heavy red button on the environmental control panel. The massive industrial secondary air scrubbers roared to life, pulling the heavy CO2-laden air through the fresh chemical beds and venting the exhaust out through a concealed surface pipe. Alexander turned around, a rare, genuine smile cracking his stoic features. He looked at Greg, who was being helped out of the freezing suit by Brenda and Leo. "The array is online," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "The air is clearing. You did it, Greg. You saved us." Greg leaned his head back against the concrete wall, closing his eyes, a weak smile on his face. "I owed you a debt, Alexander. Consider it paid." They stayed in the bunker for another 5 days. With the solar array pumping steady power into the battery banks, the oppressive tension broke. Alexander allowed the temperature to rise to a comfortable 65 degrees. He increased their rations to 1,800 calories a day. The CO2 levels dropped back to a perfect, safe 400 parts per million. In those 5 days, a profound shift occurred in the subterranean concrete room. The superficial layers of their former lives were stripped away. Greg, who had once viewed Alexander with condescending amusement, now sat for hours beside the older man, learning how to read the complex telemetry of the solar charge controllers and battery equalization cycles. Leo learned how to maintain the hydroponic water pumps, discovering a practical application for the physics he had ignored in college. Brenda, finding solace in routine, took over the meticulous tracking of their food inventory. They were no longer neighbors. They were a crew. On the morning of December 22nd, 18 days after the grid failed, the ham radio crackled to life. It wasn't static. It was a voice. "Repeating, this is Montana National Guard Airlift Command. We are beginning search and rescue grid patterns over the Bitterroot sector. if you are receiving this transmission signal with high visibility markers or flares. Ground units are currently deploying heavy machinery to clear Highway 93. Alexander reached out and keyed the microphone. National Guard Airlift, this is Alexander Pendleton, amateur radio call sign Whiskey 7 Alpha. I am located at coordinate grid. He rattled off his latitude and longitude. I have 3 survivors with me. We are secure, but the surface structures are compromised. Copy that, Whiskey 7 Alpha. We have your coordinates. A bird will be over your sector in approximately 2 hours. Alexander set the microphone down. He looked at the Higgins family. It's time to go home. They ascended the stairs together. The vault door opened and they stepped into the ruined cabin. The temperature inside was still freezing, but outside the sky was a brilliant, blinding blue. The storm had broken. The ambient temperature had clawed its way up to 15 degrees above zero. They walked out onto the snowpack. The destruction was biblical. The valley looked as though a bomb had detonated. Millions of trees lay splintered and dead. The power lines were nothing but tangled copper spaghetti lying in the snow. In the distance, Greg stared at his property. The multi-million-dollar summit was a total loss. The frozen pipes had burst, flooding the interior before freezing into a solid block of ice that cracked the foundation. The glass was gone. The smart home technology was ruined silicon. Brenda slipped her hand into Greg's. "It's gone," she whispered. "It was just glass and wire," Greg said softly, his eyes never leaving the ruins. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. A low, rhythmic thumping echoed off the canyon walls. A massive twin-engine Chinook helicopter crested the ridge its rotors, kicking up a massive cloud of snow as it hovered over Alexander's property. A rescue basket was lowered. Tom Sully Sullivan, the excavation contractor who had dug Alexander's bunker months ago, was hanging out the side door in a National Guard auxiliary uniform. He grinned, waving frantically at Alexander. As the Higgins family climbed into the basket one by one, Greg turned to Alexander. The older man was standing firmly in the snow, his hands tucked into his heavy coat. "You're not coming?" Greg asked over the roar of the rotors. Alexander shook his head, looking back at his sturdy log cabin, which, though battered, still stood strong atop its impregnable foundation. "This is my home, Greg. I have power. I have food. I'll wait out the thaw right here." Greg stepped forward and threw his arms around the older man, pulling him into a tight, fierce embrace. "I'm going to rebuild Alexander," Greg shouted over the noise. "Smaller this time, no glass, and I'm going to need the name of your concrete supplier." Alexander smiled, clapping Greg on the back. "I'll draw up the blueprints." Greg climbed into the basket with Brenda, Leo, and Barnaby. They were hoisted up into the belly of the helicopter. As the massive machine banked away, flying over the devastated frozen landscape of the Bitterroot Valley, Greg looked down. He saw the small, solitary figure of Alexander Pendleton, standing in the snow, a man who had understood the uncompromising mathematics of nature. A man who knew that when the world ends, even just for a few weeks, survival isn't bought with money. It is built with foresight, forged in discipline, and secured behind 6 inches of reinforced steel. Survival isn't a movie script. It's a brutal equation of preparation physics and mental endurance. The story of Alexander's bunker and the harsh reality the Higgins family faced is a stark reminder that our modern comforts are fragile, suspended by thin wires and vulnerable supply chains. When the grid fails and the elements strike, the difference between tragedy and survival comes down to what you've built before the storm hits. It's about respecting nature's power rather than relying entirely on technology to outsmart it. If this deep dive into the harsh reality of extreme survival gripped you, hit that like button to let us know. Share this story with anyone who thinks a smart home is a substitute for a solid backup plan. And don't forget to subscribe for more intense real-life survival breakdowns, disaster case studies, and stories of human resilience against the odds. Stay prepared, stay smart, and we'll see you in the next video.